Okay, so you're ready to dig deeper into systemic racism.
Yeah,
It's not just about individual prejudice, but how does it actually work?
right.
We've got some sources that really get into the details here,
Okay.
showing just how deep this problem is embedded in everything. And trust me, some of this stuff is really eye-opening.
Yeah, I think,
We'll be talking about
yeah.
education, employment,
Hmm.
even the criminal justice system, and that's just,
Right.
just the start.
Yeah, it's like a hidden architecture almost.
Yeah.
You don't always see it, the beams and the supports,
Right.
but they're totally shaping how the whole structure works, or in this case, malfunctions.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so insidious, right?
Yeah.
So let's start with education.
Okay.
We always hear it's the great equalizer, but is it really? I mean, does that even hold up when we look at it through the lens of systemic racism?
Well, one of the sources we have here points to a pretty disturbing example: school funding.
Okay.
In a lot of places, the money a school gets is tied to the property taxes that are collected in that area.
So meaning that richer neighborhoods end up with much better funded schools,
Yeah,
which in fact means better resources, better teachers, better opportunities for their kids.
exactly. And the reverse is also true.
Right.
So schools in predominantly black and brown communities, they often just end up with less of everything,
Yeah.
from up-to-date textbooks to qualified teachers. It's a huge disadvantage from the
Wow.
very beginning.
Yeah, it's like some kids are starting the race 100 yards behind the starting line.
Right.
And then people wonder why there are these achievement gaps.
And it's not just funding either.
Okay.
There's also research showing that the quality of education can really vary dramatically, even when you control for socioeconomic factors,
Oh, wow.
just based on the racial makeup of the student body.
So even if you have two schools with the same amount of funding,
Right.
the one in a predominantly minority neighborhood might still be at a disadvantage
Yeah.
just because of how the system is set up.
And this isn't just some kind of abstract idea. Just imagine
Yeah,
trying to learn about the world with textbooks that are like 20 years old.
right.
That's the reality for some students every single day. And that kind of
Hard to
an
imagine.
educational disadvantage,
Mm.
it has a ripple effect through their lives.
Hmm.
It can impact everything, like future jobs, how much money they can earn,
Right.
their overall well-being. It's connected.
And that brings us to the world of work.
Yeah.
Does systemic racism impact people's job opportunities, even for those who, manage to kind of overcome all those educational hurdles?
Absolutely. We've got a study here that really goes deep into hiring practices.
Okay.
So researchers sent out identical resumes
Okay.
to employers, and the only difference was the name on the application.
Okay.
Some names were like stereotypically white-sounding, others more ethnic-sounding.
Interesting.
Yeah. And the results were,
I'm guessing they weren't that surprising.
no, they were pretty stark. Resumes with white-sounding names, they got way more calls back for interviews,
Wow.
despite having,
Same exact
the
qualifications.
same exact qualifications.
So even just having a name that sounds ethnic
Yeah.
can be a disadvantage before you even walk into a room.
Sadly, yes.
Wow.
And the bias, it doesn't stop there. It shows up in everything, from salary negotiations
Yeah.
to promotion opportunities.
It really is baked into the system.
It's not just individual, prejudice.
Right, and it's not just about one thing,
Yeah.
right? Like this is what we talk about when we say it's a web of interconnected systems. Like disadvantage in one place, like
Right.
in education,
Right.
leads to disadvantage in another place,
Right.
like employment.
The World Economic Forum, they found that racial minorities often earn a lot less
Mhm.
than their white counterparts for doing the same work.
Wow.
And then there's also this issue of occupational segregation.
Okay, what is that? Occupational segregation?
So that's the tendency for certain racial groups to be like concentrated in lower paying jobs
Okay.
or industries. So think about, like domestic work,
Mm-hmm.
certain types of manual labor, or even like the gig economy.
Right.
These jobs they're essential,
Right.
but they're undervalued, they're underpaid, and, usually don't have benefits.
Yeah.
And it's not just a coincidence that certain groups are overrepresented in these fields.
Right. It all ties back to this cycle of poverty that we keep coming up against,
Yeah.
like systemic racism pushing certain groups down, making it even harder for them to get ahead.
It's like a system that's designed to keep the existing power structures in place,
Right.
and often at the expense of whole communities.
So we've got education kind of rigged against certain groups from the start.
Yeah.
And then the employment landscape just further perpetuates those disadvantages. It's
Yeah.
it's a pretty bleak picture.
And it doesn't stop there.
Right.
We still have to talk about how this plays out in the criminal justice system,
Yeah.
which is often where, the impact of systemic racism is the most blatant and really the most devastating.
We've been talking about how systemic racism impacts education and employment,
Uh-huh.
creating this cycle of disadvantage that's really,
Yeah,
really hard to break free from.
it's tough.
But it doesn't end there, right?
No, it doesn't. Unfortunately, this web of interconnected systems
Right.
extends even further, impacting something as fundamental as healthcare.
Right.
And that's where, things get really unsettling.
Yeah, I mean, everyone deserves access to quality health care,
Right.
no matter what, their background, right? But the reality is a lot more complicated than that.
It is.
What are some of the ways that systemic racism shows up in healthcare?
Well, one of the sources we have here highlights this critical issue of access to care,
Okay.
marginalized communities. They often face all these barriers
Yeah.
to even getting basic healthcare services.
Right.
They might live in areas with fewer hospitals and clinics. They might lack reliable transportation,
Right.
or even face language barriers that make navigating the system,
Yeah.
super difficult.
And then there's insurance too, right?
Yes,
We
absolutely.
know that people of color are way more likely to be uninsured
Yep.
or underinsured, which means they're more likely to delay care or
Right.
even, skip it altogether.
Right. And even when they do get health care,
Yeah.
the quality of care they get can be drastically different.
Wait, hold on.
Yeah.
You're saying that people of color
Mhm.
receive lower quality health care even when you factor in things like income and insurance.
Yeah, there's more and more research that suggests that's the case.
Wow.
And it's not just about blatant discrimination.
Right.
It's implicit bias. It's those unconscious prejudices that everyone carries.
Mm-hmm.
Even well-intentioned healthcare providers.
Right.
Studies have shown that these biases, they can influence everything.
Wow.
From diagnoses to treatment recommendations.
Really?
Which leads to, disparities in health outcomes.
So even if a doctor isn't consciously racist,
Right.
their implicit bias could still lead to unequal treatment.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's what the research is suggesting.
Wow.
And the consequences can be serious. Like,
Yeah.
one study actually found that Black women
Mm-hmm.
are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications
Wow.
than white women, even when you account for income and education.
That's a staggering statistic.
It is. It's a really stark example
Yeah.
of how systemic racism has real life devastating consequences.
Yeah.
It's not just a concept, it's about people's lives.
Yeah, and it extends beyond maternal health too, right?
Of course it does.
From
Racial minorities, they often experience higher rates of chronic diseases like diabetes, heart disease, and certain types of cancer.
Uh-huh.
And they have less access to preventative care and treatment options
Right.
that could, improve their outcomes.
And this is, I imagine this is all tied back to those socioeconomic factors that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, definitely.
The poverty, the lack of access to healthy food, the environmental hazards, all of those things
Absolutely.
that contribute to poor health outcomes, and they all disproportionately impact marginalized communities.
It's like a domino effect where systemic racism just creates this cascade of disadvantages
Right.
that impacts every aspect of a person's life.
And we saw all of this play out in a really tragic way during the COVID pandemic. I mean, the pandemic really exposed all these inequalities, didn't it?
It did. It really shone a light on.
We saw how minority communities were hit the hardest by the virus.
Yeah.
Higher infection rates,
Uh-huh.
higher death rates.
And it wasn't just the virus itself.
Ugh.
It was about those pre-existing conditions
Right.
that were made worse by years of unequal access to health care, jobs that put them at a higher risk of exposure, and even, mistrust of the medical system stemming from historical injustices.
Yeah, it's a lot.
It is. The pandemic, it really highlighted that systemic racism isn't just a problem.
Yeah.
It's a public health crisis.
We've painted a pretty bleak picture here.
It's not great.
But it's not hopeless, is it?
No, absolutely not.
I mean, there have to be things we can do
There are.
to challenge and dismantle these systems.
Absolutely. There are tons of individuals and organizations
Yeah.
working tirelessly to address this. And there are concrete steps that we can all take.
Right.
to be part of the solution. So it's not about feeling overwhelmed
Right.
or helpless. It's about understanding the problem
Yeah.
and finding ways to actively work towards change.
Okay, so let's talk solutions. Where do we even begin? How
Yeah.
do we tackle something that's embedded in our society?
Yeah.
So we spent this deep dive really exploring how systemic racism creates all these
Yeah.
barriers in education, in employment, even in healthcare.
Yeah.
It's heavy stuff, but
Right. It's a lot.
knowledge is power.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's shift gears a little bit
Agree.
and talk about solutions.
Okay. Sounds good.
Where do we go from here? Like, what can we actually do to start dismantling these systems that are so deeply ingrained?
Well, remember those four key areas we talked about?
Yeah.
Policy changes, education and awareness, community engagement, and individual action.
Right, right.
There's a lot we can do.
Yeah, okay, so that sounds like a good roadmap. Let's start with policy changes. What are some specific things that, governments, institutions can do to address systemic racism?
Well, one really important area is criminal justice reform.
Okay.
We need to take a hard look at mandatory minimum sentences,
Uh-huh.
which have disproportionately impacted um, Black and brown communities.
Right.
We also need to invest in alternatives to incarceration,
Okay.
like restorative justice programs.
And we can't forget about police reform either, right?
Absolutely not.
Like issues like racial profiling,
Uh-huh.
excessive force, and even the militarization of police departments. Like we've got to address that.
Yeah, those are key. Those are really key pieces of the puzzle.
Right.
But policy changes, they have to go beyond just the criminal justice system.
Right.
Think about housing, for example.
Okay.
Policies like redlining,
Uh-huh.
which historically, denied loans and mortgages to people of color.
Right.
That had a lasting impact on wealth inequality and segregation. And we need policies that actively promote fair housing,
Yeah.
opportunities for everyone.
And what about education funding?
Yeah.
You talked about how schools in marginalized communities
Right.
are often underfunded.
Yeah.
How do we create a system that's more equitable?
Well, we need to move away from these funding models that are based just on property taxes.
Right.
And create a system that provides all students, regardless of,
Uh-huh.
where they live, with the resources they need
Right.
to succeed. This could involve state or federal funding formulas
Okay.
that prioritize schools in low-income areas,
Right.
or initiatives that address like these specific needs
Yeah.
of students who are facing these systemic barriers.
So policy changes are huge.
Yeah, they're a big part of it.
But they're only part of the solution. What about education and awareness?
Right.
How do we raise awareness about systemic racism?
Well, I think we had to start early.
Right.
We have to incorporate accurate and comprehensive racial history into school curriculums.
Yeah.
And I think we need to start, from elementary school.
Wow. Okay.
And it can't just be like a one-off lesson during Black History Month.
Right.
It needs to be, woven throughout everything
Yeah.
to help students really understand like the historical context
Mm.
and the ongoing, legacy of systemic racism.
Because it's not just about learning dates and names, right?
No, it's not. It's about understanding the way it operates.
Right.
And continues to affect our society today.
And this education needs to continue beyond school, right?
Yeah.
Like we all have a responsibility
Yeah.
to educate ourselves as adults.
For sure, read books by authors of color, watch documentaries,
Right.
listen to podcasts that center marginalized voices.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many resources out there
Right.
to help us all deepen our understanding.
And don't be afraid to have those sometimes uncomfortable conversations with
Right.
with friends, with
I
family.
mean, it's true. It can be tough,
Yeah.
but it's so important.
Challenge racist jokes
Yeah.
or stereotypes when you hear them.
We have to normalize talking about race and racism
Right.
if we really want to create change.
Okay, let's move on to community engagement.
Okay.
What are some ways that the listeners can get involved in their communities?
Well, one really powerful way is to support organizations
Okay.
that are doing the work on the ground.
Yeah.
There are countless grassroots groups
Mm-hmm.
that are fighting for racial justice, from legal aid societies
Right.
to community organizing groups.
Yeah.
Volunteer your time, donate money,
Yeah.
or just spread the word about their work.
And if you're, passionate about a particular issue,
Right.
consider joining a local advocacy group or even just attending community meetings.
Yeah, there's power in collective action.
Absolutely. And don't underestimate the power of voting.
No, not at all.
Electing officials who are going to prioritize racial justice,
Right.
support policies that promote equity. That's crucial.
It is.
So we've got policy changes, we've
Yeah.
got education, we've got community action. What about individual action?
Okay.
So what can our listeners do every single day?
Yeah, well, just be mindful of your consumption habits.
Okay.
Support businesses that are owned by people of color.
Uh-huh.
Seek out diverse voices in the media that you consume.
Right.
And most importantly, be an ally
Right.
to marginalized communities.
Yeah.
Speak up against racism and discrimination.
It's not always easy.
No, it's not. But even if it's uncomfortable, use your privilege
Yeah.
to amplify marginalized voices
Right.
and challenge the status quo.
It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in this, right?
We do.
And that even small actions, when we all do them, can have a big impact.
They can. They really can.
Exactly. So, if you're feeling a little overwhelmed by all of this,
Mm-hmm.
just remember that you're not alone.
Right.
There are millions of people around the world
Yeah.
who are fighting for racial justice.
That's right.
And you can be part of that movement.
You can. It's not just about fighting against something.
Right.
It's about building something better. A world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Right.
No matter their race or their background.
That's a great vision
Yeah.
worth driving for. And
Yeah.
if this deep dive has sparked something in you, if it's made you think differently about the world,
Yeah.
take that energy and turn it into action.
Yeah. Read, learn, listen, engage, and most importantly, don't be silent.
Hey,
The fight for racial justice, it needs all of us.
well, this deep dive has been a journey, but it's really just the beginning.
Yeah, it is. The conversation needs to continue.
And it's a journey we have to take together.
We do.
Keep these conversations going.
Yeah.
Challenge yourself.
Challenge others.
Never stop working towards a more just and equitable future.
Right.
Thank you for joining us
Thank you.
on this incredibly important deep dive.
Yeah.
And remember, the fight for racial justice, it's a marathon, not a sprint.
That's right.
So let's keep running together.
Until we reach that finish line, of true equality for all.